Actually, Jen, I'm not going to talk about ASA24 today. I left the technology to you. We're often paired together at meetings. So you probably assumed I'd be talking about ASA24, but actually I'm going to talk more broadly about the value overall of self-report dietary data and the challenges related to data collection, analysis, and interpretation. So I just want to say that it's really snowy here. This is my front yard, and back there somewhere is a street that's not plowed. And as I speak to you now, also looking a little scruffy as Janet was, only you can't see me. I'm in my son's bedroom staring out the window, hoping a plow will come through at some point. It started snowing Friday, and I still can't get out of my driveway with 3 feet of snow. So I hope all of you there are nice and warm, but I'm sitting here in a beautiful snowy environment and did a little cross-country skiing yesterday. So the outline of my talk is here. As Reagan alluded to early in the beginning of the session, there's been a lot of recent criticism of self-report data. I'm going to talk about what those have been, talk about error, which we clearly everyone knows we have error in self-report data, and talk about the fact that these are been mostly related to reports of energy underreporting, how big it is, what are the implications of the measurement error, and what recommendations we have in terms of surveillance and epidemiology. I'm going to cover those two areas and conclusions. Now let me start my timer. Actually, I meant to start it before so that I know I'm not going to be able to see the 5-minute warning sign unless you've got some magic there. I'm going to turn this on. Okay, so I'll assume I'm a couple minutes in already. So we have had some recent criticisms of self-report dietary data, and these are based primarily on one nutrient, and that is energy, and the underreporting that's found in dietary self-report data, indicating, therefore, the implication is based on this energy underreporting that the dietary self-report data have no value. So this is based primarily on a paper that was published with Ed Archer as the author, and here's the title of that. And here are some other things that have been sort of following the publication of the Archer paper. That there was quite a bit of many other publications on the same topic, and here you see some of the headlines on these other papers, which certainly make it look as if because of the underreporting found in primarily in the Archer paper, that we have completely flawed data and maybe that they're not useful for really anything. That's the implication. So I've given you the references for these at the bottom of this. So this has been quite a big thing in the field. The field has been under attack, and I'd like to address some of these criticisms and talk about where there really is value for our self-report data. And because it's been sort of dramatic, there has been a lot of attention to this topic in the popular press. So here are some things, here are some things that have been in the popular press. Quotes such as, our data are mere pseudoscience, and that our techniques are invalid, and it implies that the field has been perpetrating fraud against the taxpayers, and that this fraud is far greater than any perpetrated in the private sector, such as Enron and Madoff scandals. So I don't want people to think that this is a small thing. There's been some really, really contentious language used in describing our dietary data, in particular this NHANES data. And the last one you see here, to say that the data are imperfect is the equivalent of saying that the Titanic had a flotation problem or a buoyancy problem. These data should not be used. So you can see that there's been quite a bit of attention, and I think we should know that this is filtered into study sections and to people trying to do research using self-report dietary data, not just in the United States, but certainly in Canada, and really I'm not sure how this is playing in other countries. So with that as the backdrop, I'd like to talk a little bit about measurement error, because what this is pointing to is error. So I don't need to really say this to this audience, I'm sure, but measurement error is the difference between the observed or measured value and the true value. And there are two basic types of error: random error, which is inherent in all measures, which is just the sort of thing that's just going to happen. It's in any direction. It isn't biased in any direction. It goes, it just doesn't change things terribly. And then there's systematic error, and this is the big error that people worry about. It can cause erroneous findings. It's the bias that people bring to the table, and if it's, too strong, it can be problematic. So the real question here is, does the systematic error in self-report dietary data render them useless? Because we do have some systematic error. We know, for example, that people who are overweight are more likely to underreport than people who are of normal weight. So there's bias in that. We know women report differently from men and things like that. But there also has been some discussion of the fact that all self-report data are useless, that people have terrible memories. They really can't self-report anything. But we use self-report data, and I know you all know this, frequently in our research, and it does lead to valuable findings. And the fact of the matter is that people underreport the amount that they smoke, or they overreport the amount that they may be physically active. And we're still quite able, using self-report data, to find really valuable findings related to health outcomes. Another one, folate and mineral-2 defects, really have much of that was first based on self-report data of dietary intakes and folate. And just to point out the obvious, that the error exists not just in self-report data, but it's also, as you all know, in clinical and laboratory data as well. There are issues with quality control and needle to freezer sorts of transport of laboratory data. So what are the sources of measurement error in our self-reported data? Within person variation, that's the day-to-day variation, which was alluded to by several speakers earlier in this session. This is the sort of thing that we can easily do statistical adjustment for with repeat applications and modeling, and that was discussed by the first speaker when it came to looking at population distributions. Another source of self-report error would be obviously memory, depending on whatever method you're using. The error in our nutrient and food databases, the fact that, and Janet, you alluded to this, default recipes and portion sizes are used, or composites and things like that. And then in the end, it's the systematic bias, the misreporting based on individual characteristics that is inherent in our self-report data. I just want to say, I'm not pointing to the fact that the error doesn't exist. What I'm wanting to point to here is that we've been talking about this kind of error for quite a long time. So energy intake that has been sort of accused of being poorly measured is in fact inaccurately estimated by self-report. This is the major criticism that the field is under, and I'm here, the first one to tell you, and probably not the first one to tell you, that this major criticism is true. Based on doubly labeled water, which measures energy expenditure and is a surrogate for energy intake under energy balance conditions, based on doubly labeled water and estimated energy requirements, another way of sort of assessing whether people are reporting energy intakes accurately. People underreport their energy by a significant amount. And I think it's something that our field must widely acknowledge at this point. We can't brush it under the table. The data show that we have an underreport of energy that's significant. And this error does vary by instrument, but it also varies by population characteristics, as I alluded to earlier. I want to also address briefly the sources of energy misreporting by the main instruments that we use to collect data, either in epidemiology or surveillance. First, the food frequency questionnaire. This is a tool that was never intended to measure energy at any level. It was more to get a sort of usual intake of salt. We do put energy values as well as other nutrient values on a food frequency questionnaire. Thinking about what FFQs really are, they are a finite list of foods and beverages. They have limited specificity, certainly, with respect to each line item. They're the kind of composite of various foods that goes on in the database is pretty big when it comes to FFQs. So it's actually not at all surprising that you would get an underreport on a food frequency questionnaire given these considerations. Moving on to 24-hour recalls, we know there are issues related to memory. People are going, if anything, that they're not going to overreport, they're going to underreport because they may forget certain items that they consume, and there's always a difficulty in estimating quantity. That's kind of across the board for most of these instruments unless we are doing some weighing. Finally, with food records, the biggest source of underreporting is reactivity, that being that people know they're recording what they eat and they change what they eat to eat less often. We know this is true. They tell us that it's true. There's research showing that it's true. And the same other things in estimating quantity. And even though food records are meant to be completed in real time, we know that people often complete them at the end of the day. So in that way, they're similar to recalls because people can forget the things that they ate earlier. So why do we have energy reporting and what does it mean? So I just indicated the limitations of each instrument. We also have issues related to social desirability in an environment that stigmatizes obesity. So people are not always willing to admit to what they eat or to report it accurately. And finally, I want to emphasize that energy is in nearly every food that we consume. So at least for energy, small and large errors are going to add up. The energy intake errors, therefore, are likely larger in magnitude than for other nutrients and food groups. So the bottom line is that we know the data have flaws and that this requires thoughtful analysis and interpretation. And as I said earlier, the nutrition community acknowledges this measurement error problem. There's been ongoing research in the error of measurement error since the 70s, going back to George Beaton and maybe before that even. We've always acknowledged the limitations of our self-report. It doesn't mean that some individuals who are publishing papers always acknowledge the limitations, but by and large, people do know that they have error in their data collection. We've also made some progress to sort of mitigate the issues around measurement error through, appropriate study design, selection of the number and types of instruments, various statistical modeling that will reduce but not eliminate the error, and we have recommendations regarding how to interpret the findings of studies given that we have measurement error. So next I want to address the magnitude of underreporting. I want to discuss a study called the Validation Studies Pooling Project, in which in the U.S. we combined data from 4 of the largest recovery biomarker studies ever conducted. All of them had, and that means I think over 400 participants, all had double-labeled water and multiple 24-hour urines. And so therefore, we looked at energy, protein, potassium, and sodium. All the studies had food frequency questionnaires, and some number, at least 2 24-hour recalls, some had more. And I know this is a busy slide, but the energy underreporting I want to talk about first, and then I want to talk about energy versus the other nutrients we were able to look at, and the difference between different instruments. So that's a lot to do on one slide, but I hope to just leave you with the bottom line. First, let's look at energy. food frequency questionnaires versus 24-hour recalls. And you can see the percent of underreporting on FFQs across these various studies and different sex groups were averaged between 24 and 33%. If you looked at energy underreporting on 24-hour recalls, it was 6 to 16%, so quite a bit lower. Still a problem. I'm not saying there wasn't a problem, but 6 to 16% for young and middle-aged adults. Within that study, we had women from the WHI, and they, at this point, this was just not too long ago, they were quite elderly. So the energy underreporting in the elderly women was greater, and it might indicate problems with 24-hour recalls in an elderly population in terms of memory. Not really sure, but those are the data. But now turning from energy to other nutrients, looks like I left off the FFQ here. Oh, that was a mistake. Okay, sorry about that, and I don't know the number off the top of my head. But I can tell you that it's greater for FFQs versus 24-hour recalls. But for 24-hour recalls, just comparing between energy and other nutrients such as protein and potassium, you can see also that the percent underreporting drops quite a bit compared to the what we got for energy above. And then I just want to mention one other study, which was done by Patrick et al. In a controlled feeding study. And we looked at reported versus known intakes on 24-hour recalls, and they were not significantly different for foods and nutrients. So let's go back to the recent claims regarding error in NHANES, that the source of that was the Archer paper I alluded to early on that was published in 2013. And the claim was that 67.3% of women and 58.7% of men reported energy intake so low as to be physiologically implausible. And those percentages have been now reported over and over again and cited over and over again, both in the science and in the popular press. But using part of those same data from NHANES 3 only, the Archer paper used multiple years of NHANES. If you look at someone who analyzed the exact same thing, but just using one set of those data in 1997, Ronette Breifel published a paper that was actually, the purpose of which was exactly the same, was sort of to figure out the percentage of people who were severe underreporters, called implausible reporters by the Archer paper. And using the same data, the percentages, as you can see, are much lower. And how is that possible? Well, what they both used is the Goldberg method. I don't have time to explain it, but it's a way of using different cut points for describing who the underreporters are. And if you look through the literature that Goldberg published over the years, it's clear that Archer used the wrong cut points at the individual level, and that if he had used the correct cut points, his numbers still would have indicated underreporting, but it would have not been as severe as he reported it. So as I said earlier, the recent claims regarding error in the surveillance data generated an incredible number of media reports, and it continues to this day that these data get quoted and that the authors of the paper report this at meetings. And there have been also now a number of refutations. One is mine, which is the basis for this talk. I have the citations for these listed. And so far, I haven't had any reporter call me to talk about my paper. And I doubt the others have actually gotten any media interest in the fact that there are refutations to the Archer paper. So now I want to go back to talk about what are the implications of the kinds of error we have in self-report data for surveillance, and then I will talk about it in relation to epidemiology. So first, getting back to energy collected from 24-hour recalls, because that is primarily what we use in dietary surveillance. What this means for surveillance is that Since there is a bias towards underreporting, energy distributions are shifted to the left. First, and therefore it will affect the cut points. If you want to know people who are above a certain cut point, it's going to be off because of the shift in the distribution. And the correction for bias further must consider the population subgroups, since I mentioned that there is bias by population characteristics such as BMI, education, et cetera. So therefore, these distributions will be biased and difficult to interpret. So what might we do? If we could get W-labeled water, that would be optimal, but we all know it's pretty expensive and often impractical. But we do need to know that when we look at energy in relation in surveillance, our distributions are skewed. And let's talk now, since there is this huge problem of obesity and a lot of discussion in the papers that have criticized our data about energy balance, and they focus entirely on energy, I think we need to show that both intake and expenditure are both very difficult to measure when it comes to energy. This we know is true from self-report, but even if we have physical activity monitors, which are objective, taking monitor data and translating that into energy expenditure is also incredibly difficult and error-prone. So if we're interested in energy balance, none of our methods that are used at the population level are actually going to be able to give us a good sense of intake and expenditure. And so if that's the thing we must study, energy balance, and we want to understand the science of energy balance, the best measures are whether people are, gaining weight, measures of waist circumference over time, or in a sort of more clinical study to use controlled feeding studies. But just because we can't use our data for energy balance in surveillance, I would submit to you that the data are incredibly valuable with other obesity-related questions, because even though there may be an underreport, we are still learning a lot about the types of foods consumed, contextual factors about when and with whom food is eaten. We have a sense of nutrient adequacy, and in terms of, not the energy component, and we have a good assessment of nutrient or food group quality. An example of that would be intake per 1,000 calories as measured within the components of the Healthy Eating Index. As many of you know, the Healthy Eating Index is based on dietary guidance in the U.S. It is a measure of diet quality, therefore it is measured in relation to energy intake. And here's a really great example from our surveillance data of the kind of valuable information we can learn despite the fact that we have energy underreporting. These bars indicate the various different components of the Healthy Eating Index, and if you get a bar close to 100, it means that you're close to meeting the recommendation for that component. So here you can see that whole fruit, and I think I had notes on this, and now I can't show them because I have to show you my whole screen. So you can see that we're not doing so well on greens and beans and whole grains. Those are the 1, 2, 3, 4th and 5th bars. And, a lot of these things are things we wouldn't expect people to underreport. If anything, we think maybe they would overreport these. So these kinds of data, if anything, our findings show there are huge problems which are worth knowing about in terms of creating nutrition policy decisions. And if anything, these findings in terms of whole fruit or other things are worse than what we're showing here, because there could be either over or underreporting. So in terms of empty calories, which is the last bar, you can see that by far people are doing very poorly in terms of meeting dietary recommendations, which would be limiting empty calories. And if anything, those are the kinds of things people would underreport. Here are the major sources of sodium in the diets of the U.S. population. And so, again, while we might have some underreporting of some of these foods, it's still important to know where people are getting their sodium in terms of policy decisions. And how about cut points? What percentage of persons eat less than the recommended intake of fruits? And you can say 76% are consuming less than the recommendation. If they're over-reporting their fruit intake, this is even worse than we can imagine. So, again, I'm showing these to indicate the valuable information we get from our surveillance data. So what are the implications? We get valuable insights. For example, the added sugar consumption far exceeds recommendations, that overall diet quality is not consistent with dietary guidelines. And as I said already, to the extent that the bias exists, I pretty much said this, and I'm getting tight on time. So these data are valuable and warrant corrective action and have implications for nutrition policy, despite the fact we have some underreporting of energy. So let's move on to epidemiology. We should strive to collect recovery biomarker when possible, in at least a subset of our population, because when we have those data, it allows us to do measurement error adjustment. We should not use absolute energy as an exposure variable in epidemiology. I mean, for the most part, we're using FFQs. We know that the energy is measured poorly, and so we can't use energy as an exposure variable. On the other hand, I am wrapping up. I just got a note. This is a good way to tell me to wrap up on my cell phone. I'm trying to wrap up, yes. We should collect, if you can collect double labeled water to correct for energy and self-report, you should do so. But you shouldn't use double labeled water to energy adjust other nutrients and food groups. You have to use self-reported energy because you want, those kinds of errors are correlated. So you use self-reported energy to do energy adjustment for other self-reported food groups and nutrients. And in multivariate models of disease risk, control for self-reported energy intake, that's pretty much the standard. It reduces bias, but don't use the energy coefficients to make inferences about diet health. So if you find an association in epidemiology, that the error likely means that the associations are underestimated. Yes, residual confounding can occur, but it doesn't usually lead to spurious findings. And the best thing is when you get a strong signal across lots of studies. We've always said this in epidemiology and in science in general. When you get a strong signal across many studies, the finding is likely to be true. And FFQs are most likely to fail to detect important associations, especially if small. So we're more likely missing things than finding things that are spurious. So we've all recently heard about this report on the relationship between red and processed meat and cancer, and just highlighting here that there was a fair amount of epidemiologic research done that led to the part of the evidence for the findings of meat and cancer. It wasn't all the evidence, because it was, when you look at the totality of evidence, not just for epi, but with that laboratory studies and other biologic data that help them make their conclusions. Also want to show you something from the Dietary Patterns Methods project. This is a study that looked at 3 different large epi cohorts, AARP, the multi-ethnic cohort, and the Women's Health Initiative. And it looked at a number of different indices, HEI, the Healthy Eating Index, the Alternative Healthy Eating Index, the, Alternative Mediterranean Diet Score, and the DASH, Dietary, so, you guys know what DASH is. I can't think of it, to stop hypertension. Anyway, what I want to show you here is that we looked at all-cause mortality in all 3 of these cohorts. And you can see when using any one of these indices indicated by these different bars, that there was overall diet quality was significantly associated. So this is like an example of using a totality of data across a number of studies to get consistent results. And just quickly, I'm only showing you the women, it was similar for men. This outcome with CVD mortality, you see a similar thing, wider confidence interval, because we have fewer cases. And here it is for cancer mortality for the women. So you can see when we look across multiple studies in epi and we get consistent findings, we start to really trust them. So overall, for either epi or surveillance, as we look to the future of how we do our data collection, analysis, and interpretation, for sure we want to improve our tools. That's never something we should give up on, and technology may help. We certainly need to evaluate whether technology is indeed better than our old-fashioned methods, but certainly they save us money and can be more efficient. So we still should strive to improve the tools, as Jen indicated. We might think about combining dietary assessment instruments if possible. The citation below is a paper indicating that it might be good to combine recalls in a epi study with an FFQ to sort of balance out the pros and cons of each. If you're interested in energy, consider administering double labeled water. And we should, in fact, look towards research to more affordably measure energy intake and expenditure, maybe better ways of administering double labeled water so it's not as expensive or more efficient. But the self-report data are still useful for patterns and diet quality, so we should properly interpret our data as well. Okay, I'm going to move on because I'm running out of time. I said most of this anyway. So here are the conclusions. At the end of the paper that on which I based this talk, we list 7 conclusions with respect to error in dietary data. First, we would say definitely continue to collect self-report dietary data, intake data for surveillance and epidemiology. There's no reason not to continue it, even though there's energy underreporting. The field needs to acknowledge that we can't use self-reported energy intake as a measure of energy intake or for energy balance. Absolute energy intake, we know, is highly flawed, but we should use that same self-reported energy intake for energy adjustment of other self-reported dietary constituents. There's a number of papers showing that that improves risk estimation for epidemiology. And certainly in our papers, we must continue to acknowledge limitations of self-report dietary data, analyze and interpret them appropriately. And in our epi studies in particular, design them to conduct analyses that will allow for adjustment for measurement error because by and large, adjusting for the error using calibration or validation sub-studies in epidemiology is better than doing nothing. It definitely improves the analyses with respect to dietary data and outcomes. And when we design new epi studies, as I said earlier, maybe collect both short and long-term instruments. By that I mean 24 recalls or food records and an FFQ to get at the benefits of both and limit the limitations of both, of either, I should say. And finally, and this is my last comment, we should continue to develop, evaluate, and further expand our methods, including biomarkers and new technologies. So thank you very much, and I guess I'll hang on for later. And please, I think my main point is, although we've had a lot of criticisms of our self-report data, I would say there's so much value there, and we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy.